few months ago, I spoke about guilt on this show, and that really struck a chord with so many of you. So many of us suffer from guilt, have all sorts of consequences in our personal lives because of guilt, and hold ourselves back because of it. But many of you also responded because of feelings of shame. And shame and guilt often seem to be part of the same story, but in fact they're not. So today we're going to talk a little bit about shame and understand what that is, where it really comes from, and perhaps what we can do to help ourselves. It might seem that shame and guilt are very much the same thing, and they are often confused with each other, but they're not quite the same thing. Guilt, as you know, is a feeling that we have when we think that we've done something wrong, and we know that we've done something wrong. And usually, guilt is associated with feeling bad about that, and we feel that we have to correct it or fix it, or that we need to, in some way, wrong the injustice that might have been done to someone else. I mean, when we feel guilty for what we've done, and generally it's for what we've done to someone else or something else, because we've inflicted some kind of harm or what we imagine to be harm, and so guilt is kind of a feeling of remorse. We also are kind of able to talk about guilt. You know, very often we can talk about the situation that made us feel guilty. We will admit to someone that we feel guilty because of blah blah, or we might even say, I am guilty of whatever it may be, and it seems to be quite an appropriate place for confession, where we're able to admit that. We don't easily talk about many of our feelings, but guilt is one that in that way we can talk about it. It's interesting because I've always been fascinated how guilt is, of course, a word that means legal responsibility for. And within a legal system, if you are guilty of something, there are amends that you can make. So either you're sentenced to imprisonment, hopefully not, or to pay a fine, or to engage in some form of redressive action. So the fact that even in our emotional lives we're able to respond to our own feelings of guilt with confession, or things where we try or at least where we acknowledge that we have this feeling and we have done something wrong. And of course the acknowledgement of that itself is part of the process of helping ourselves, of treating it, and the result of the confession, the classical Christian confession, where in response to a confession you have to make amends in a spiritual way. Well, whatever kind of amends we can make helps expunge the feelings of guilt that we have. But shame isn't something that we talk about. Shame, so much so, not being something we talk about, is often something we hide. Shame doesn't seem to have the same characteristics. We can talk about the situation that made us feel guilty. We're not likely to talk about the situation that's making us feel shame or ashamed. So, in fact, not only are we not likely to talk about it, we'll probably hide it. Shame seems to be an emotion that we feel is itself wrong, that we shouldn't be having. Whereas guilt, well, we kind of feel that we should be having that, even if we're not always right, and even if guilt is not always constructive. Guilt is usually related to the understanding of, I've done something which is not correct in some way. It doesn't help, or it hurts, or something like that. And there is a regression, there is something we can talk about, and I can admit that. Whereas we don't admit that about what makes us feel ashamed. There are key reasons for that, and which explains the key difference between shame and guilt. As you've heard me say, with guilt, we feel that we have done something wrong. There is an action I have taken that is wrong. With shame, we feel that we ourselves are the problem. Shame is when we think we're a bad person, that there's something wrong with ourself, not with our action. So with guilt, we separate the action from ourselves, and we say, I did this thing, that is wrong, that I need acceptance for, or I need forgiveness for, or in some way we can fix. Whereas with shame, we say, I am wrong. I am the bad person. There is something wrong with me. No wonder we don't want to talk about it. No wonder we don't broadcast it. No wonder we hide it. But where does that come from? Shame is an extremely painful emotion. And like any other kind of pain, we will do everything in our power to avoid feeling it. Which then means that if we are in a situation where we feel shame or are made to feel shame, it's extra painful because it's got this extra connotation of not only is there something wrong with me, but I'm now in a state of distress. I'm feeling these feelings that themselves are like a sickness. People can feel frozen. Paralysis is a very common result of feeling shame. Unable to act, unable to do anything. It can cause physiological symptoms like sweating or rapid heartbeats or things like that, headaches, dizziness. It raises people's blood pressure. It causes a lot of internal fear. So there's like an autonomic response. There's a response in our body to feelings of shame, exactly as there is a response to other kinds of pain. So shame is bad, and because it produces pain, we respond, we try and pull away from the pain as well. So the secrecy of the shame and the badness of the shame gets multiplied. Because it's interesting how we even feel shame around pain and sickness. How many people don't talk about it when they're sick? They say, I'm fine, when they're not. We have a certain amount of stigma attached to sickness and especially to pain. So when people acknowledge pain, it's like acknowledging weakness or acknowledging there's something wrong with me. There might be all sorts of reasons why we don't want to acknowledge that, other than just feeling the pain, and why we don't want to admit that, because illness itself and our physical frailty is so challenging to us. But can you hear it's the same issue? That we feel shame about pain. We don't want to talk about it, and we feel as if there's something wrong with me, which in illness, of course, there may very well be. So it's very similar to the shame itself. I don't want to admit that there's something wrong with me. And with illness, pain, I don't want to admit that there's something wrong with me. So it's got this double reaction of, on the one hand, there's something wrong with me, and on the other hand, I have something to hide, which is of course another wrong thing, but it's not necessarily acknowledged as that, but it multiplies the situation. So the extreme pain of shame is a lot like the extreme pain of actually being in physical pain and having a real good physical reason for that. But it does beg the question of what is it that really causes shame. The very well-known psychologist and researcher Brené Brown, you'll find her on YouTube, talks a lot about shame. And she says that shame is the intensely painful feeling or experience of believing that we are flawed and therefore unworthy of love or belonging. That is the key definition that explains what shame is and why it is so painful. We feel that we are unloved and we feel that we don't belong. And there's so many other feelings attached to those two things, because it must be because there's something wrong with me. If I'm not loved, I'm not lovable. And so there must be something wrong with me. And so in the same way as we respond to physical pain that way and physical illness that way, we often want to hide it. It's not always the response. Some people will seek sympathy because of illness. Some people will seek help. Because at least with illness, there's often a sense of it's random bad luck, or it's not my fault that I'm ill. Many illnesses, we can say that about ourselves. We don't say that about shame, because shame very often arises either out of an early life experience or some other time of life experience where the shame is imposed on us by others, and it can start very young. You're bad at this, you're useless at this, you're a bad dancer, your brothers get high marks, what's wrong with you? There must be something wrong with you. It can start in a child, when a child is made to feel bad about themselves. Very often it's about their physicality. Our physicality, like if someone is overweight, they can be made to feel shame and therefore that they're wrong. Or if someone is gay, or if someone is different in any kind of way. If someone comes from a family where the problem is perceived, they still get dumped on the shame. So like people might come from parents who are divorced or parents who are poor, and the child is made to feel shame often by other children in that situation. So it commonly starts in childhood, but certainly not exclusively. But what you are hearing in those examples that I'm giving is that shame is often imposed on us by others, that we then start seeing, especially if we're young, we start seeing as the truth about ourselves, the definition of ourselves. That person clearly does not love me. That person is telling me all these horrible things about myself. They don't love me. Clearly, therefore, I am unlovable. Therefore, I have something to feel shame about. It must be my fault. It's not like a virus that I caught. And it's shameful because everyone is lovable. Obviously, I need to hide that. People mustn't know how unlovable I am, because then they're all going to immediately stop loving me. Maybe I've got a chance if they don't know that I'm actually unlovable. Maybe I can fool someone into loving me because I actually am unlovable. And so it's taken on board as part of the identity. Remember, the key difference between guilt and shame is that guilt is about something I did. Shame is about who I am. And who I am is so fundamental and so key to our emotional health that it is a much greater danger and a much greater problem when the problem lies there. Of course, like all emotions, including negative emotions, it does have a function psychologically. So shame is a way that we understand that we feel inadequate, that there's some inadequacy inside. It kind of tells us that we feel unworthy, although it's often interpreted as I am unworthy. So it is argued by some that it's a valuable emotion, like other emotions can be, because they propel us to make changes. So like the other negative emotions, shame should propel us to make changes. But the problem with shame is that it says that there's something wrong with you. It's not saying you're doing something wrong. It's not even saying they're doing something wrong to you. It's saying you are essentially flawed. You are the problem. So it's one thing to say that negative emotions are kind of designed to propel us into positive actions, but with shame that's particularly difficult, especially since other people are so able to trigger shame in us. So however much we work on ourselves, shame is often triggered by the external person, because if shame is a form of judgment of ourselves, as we've seen, that judgment usually initially comes from other people. So that's usually why we're going to hide it as well, because other people see this in us. There can be shame, of course, that arises from ourselves. We can fail to meet our own standards and expectations and feel ashamed because of that. And it's when we start interpreting that as there's something wrong with me and I'm fundamentally flawed that we end up essentially with exactly the same problem. But still, even then, we're likely to hide. So while the response to guilt is often the attempt to do something about it, and if you watch the episode of guilt, then you know that sometimes that's a misplaced attempt as well. Often react there where we shouldn't. With shame, because of its secret nature, because we tend to hide our feelings of shame, we don't seek help, we don't express it out into the world, and it often goes back into the self in a variety of ways. 3 examples, the most classic ways which spring to mind. Firstly is internalizing it completely and taking it on board that way because it's part of a hiding experience. The fact is that many things that we are made to feel shame about, whether it's your weight or your sexuality or your socioeconomic circumstances or those of your parents or anything else, are not things we really easily could change. They seem to us to be fait accompli, things that are a given. Many of those things are, and we're made to feel shame about our bodies. This is your body. So it's so fundamentally made to feel wrong about yourself that when you look at it objectively like that, it's obvious that it's wrong to make people feel shame for what they're born as, because that's who they are and they don't necessarily have any kind of control over that. And even if they did, why do we have to make them feel as if there's something wrong with them? That side of the shame story is a topic for an altogether different discussion, and maybe one that we not so easily have, because one of the endless puzzles of the world for me is why human beings have such a strong need to take each other down. Why do human beings have such a strong need to tell each other they're bad, they're wrong, and what they can't do? It's huge, and as I've said on this show before, social media has made it even huger and has made it even more visible. And as you know from social media, there's an awful amount of shaming behavior when someone does anything that is perceived wrong, and with so many people out there, by almost anyone, it becomes quite a minefield. So we hide, internalizing or withdrawing, a very common result of shame. Another very common result of shame is addictive behavior. So, which can have a variety of different reasons why we do it, but engaging in another behavior as a way of not acknowledging this behavior. So as you know, many addictions are related to not wanting to feel certain things, not wanting to think about certain things, not wanting to face certain things. So some kinds of addiction are an escape away from that, and that certainly can have a lot to do with shame. But it's well known by researchers in the field that addiction is often linked originally to a feeling of shame. So you're made to feel very much less than. So you retreat into, say, alcohol, probably the most common addiction, and then you'll start feeling shame about that. Because on the one hand, you know that the secret drinking or too much drinking, whatever it is itself a shameful thing, something which indicates that you are bad. And so on the other hand also, the knowledge of that loop, that you're now hiding your drinking, is another reason to know that there's obviously something wrong with me, I'm bad. And so it's a negative behavior that, as we know, addictive behaviors are almost inevitably downward spirals. So that's a very dangerous consequence of shame. And perhaps what is one of the most common responses to shame is to push the emotion away from yourself and direct it at another person. How does that happen? Well, of course that comes out as aggression and violence towards others. Very often violence or aggression that's directed at another person is a refusal and a failure to acknowledge or accept certain feelings within oneself. It's a common result of failing to acknowledge things about yourself. And one of the most basic things is feelings of powerlessness or lack of control, that the control is then achieved by dominating, controlling, and having power over another person. Frequently, attacking another person is a way of not owning your own feelings, disowning your own feelings, and escaping the negative effects of shame. Something that's very important to understand about shame is that it fundamentally affects our self-esteem. If we start believing that there's something wrong with what we're doing or who we are or what we look like, obviously that affects our valuing of ourselves. And when our self-value goes down, we, in order to perhaps deal with that, we need to find people who are less valuable than ourselves, or we need to drag them down. So sometimes, as a way of escaping the feeling that shame has of reducing our sense of ourselves, we attack someone else, we shame someone else. And, typically someone who's feeling inadequate will try and make their partner feel inadequate. They will try and make her feel more inadequate than themselves. And like that, she starts becoming weak or self-conscious, needing of his approval. He can now give his approval and blame her for her feelings, and suddenly he's feeling powerful again. But it's because of his own sense of inadequacy and his own lack of esteem, because he has no authentic power. He has nothing authentic that gives him warm feelings from her. The only way he can get warm feelings from her is when she seeks his approval to overcome the shame that he is enforcing on her when he's the one who's actually feeling shame. That is very dangerous because it can lead to serious and dangerous violence and abuse and emotional abuse in relationship situations. And one of the reasons for that is because shame can also make us feel anger. If something devalues us and triggers shame, we can respond with a great deal of anger. And that can make us behave unpredictably, if you like. We have to then take down someone else's happiness or joy, or we have revenge fantasies, anger fantasies. It can be all-consuming, and then that becomes a behavior where we try and take someone else down in response. Sometimes the feelings of shame are more familiar, and rather than feeling the grief, the sadness, the depression, the melancholy, the helplessness that often comes along with feelings of shame and feelings of self-inadequacy, just like anger is a cover-up for those feelings, shame can be a cover-up. So instead of really addressing what's making me depressed or I am feeling lonely, we just turn it into there's something wrong with me, which is more familiar and which might also lead to self-pitying behavior or might get a response from others or whatever. It can be a way of not addressing our issues. So how do we address shame then? Shame is not something that we cure. The reason we're feeling shame needs to be addressed. And we need to re-own, firstly, what it is about ourselves that we've made to feel shameful about. Because remember, very often, the thing that we've made to feel shameful about is something core about ourselves that we should rather build ourselves and build our self-esteem about, rather than have to get rid of whatever this is that's making them shame me. Dealing with shame involves dealing with our feelings, owning them so that we can change them. Recognizing that it's not about the truth of what that person says to me, it's about my inadequacy, feelings of inadequacy in response to that. The chances are the feelings will fade because no emotions last forever. But we need to use it as an opportunity to self-reflect and take back power. Shame, being shamed, is about losing power, about giving power away, and about having power taken away from ourselves. When we acknowledge that other people's thoughts about ourselves and other people's feelings have nothing to do with me, that other people's judgments of me are actually about themselves, not about me. And then I can start working on self-esteem. Once we understand that other people's efforts to shame me are in fact an effort to control me, then we can sometimes take the right attitude of how to deal with that. Once we realize that shame is a form of self-judgment, we can develop compassion towards ourselves. And once we develop compassion towards ourselves, we will start losing our feelings of shame and eventually build our feelings of worth. Even if shame is not your game, always valuable to learn that self-reflection helps us understand and even prevent emotional issues that cause pain in our lives. I'll see you next week with the month ahead.